I stared into the steel belly of my floor safe. $85,000, my entire life savings, was completely gone. Then, the floorboards creaked. I turned to see my mother leaning against the doorframe, a chilling, triumphant smile on her face. "Consider it back pay," she whispered. But she had no idea the hell she had just unleashed. "My name is Thomas. For the last 10 years, I've worked 70-hour weeks running a mid-sized commercial HVAC company. I didn't grow up with money. In fact, I grew up with the exact opposite. I grew up with the crushing weight of utility shutoff notices, eviction warnings, and the ever-present anxiety of a mother who treated finances like a game of roulette. Her name is Margaret. To the outside world, she was a charming, vivacious woman who could light up a room. To me, she was a walking hurricane of debt and broken promises. Despite our history, I believed in the unbreakable bond of family. I believed that if I just worked hard enough, provided enough stability, and set a good enough example, she would eventually settle down. I was the eldest, the parentified child who took on the burden of raising my younger sister, Fiona, while our mother chased get-rich-quick schemes and a carousel of smooth-talking boyfriends. By the time I was 32, I had built a fortress of security around myself. I owned a modest but beautiful 4-bedroom house in the suburbs. I had investments, a solid 401k, and no debt. But my most prized possession, the absolute core of my financial security, was kept off the grid. It was an old-school habit born from childhood trauma. I didn't trust banks with everything. I had an industrial-grade Holland floor safe bolted into the foundation of my home office, hidden beneath a heavy oak floorboard and an expensive Persian rug. Inside that safe was $85,000 in crisp $100 bills, the cash from the recent sale of my fully restored 1969 Mustang, Mach 1, combined with 5 years of emergency cash hoarding. It also held my late grandfather's collection of gold Krugerrands, the only true family heirloom we had left. It was a chilly Tuesday evening in November when the hurricane made landfall at my dining room table. I had invited Margaret, Fiona, and Margaret's newest fiancé, Vincent, over for dinner. I spent 3 hours slow roasting a prime rib, determined to host a peaceful family gathering. Fiona had just gotten a promotion at her marketing firm, and I wanted to celebrate. "Oh, Tommy, the beef is just divine," Margaret cooed, taking a generous sip of her Cabernet. She was wearing a new silk blouse that I knew she couldn't afford, her hair freshly blown out. "You always were such a domesticated boy. Your future wife will be very lucky, assuming you ever stop working long enough to find one." "Thanks, Mom," I said, ignoring the backhanded compliment. I turned to my sister. "So, Fiona, how's the new account manager role treating you?" Fiona rolled her eyes, swirling her wine. "It's fine, more money, but the taxes take half of it anyway. Honestly, I'm already looking at new apartments, but the first and last month's rent requirement is brutal right now." She shot me a lingering, expectant look. In the past, that look meant, "Thomas, write me a check." But I had cut off the financial pipeline 2 years ago. I loved my sister, but I refused to enable her anymore. "You'll figure it out," I said evenly, cutting a piece of meat. "Budgeting takes practice." Vincent, a slick-haired man in his late 50s who claimed to be a venture capitalist but drove a leased BMW with expiring tags, chuckled. "Budgeting is for the working class, Tommy. Real wealth is built on leverage, taking calculated risks." Margaret and I were just talking about a commercial real estate flip down in Florida. Just needs a little seed capital to get the escrow moving. I felt my jaw tighten. "Is that right?" "Absolutely," Margaret chimed in, her eyes gleaming with that dangerous, manic excitement I knew all too well. "It's a guaranteed triple return in 6 months. We just need 90,000 to secure our equity share." We were hoping, as a family. "No," I said, putting my fork down. The clink of silver against porcelain echoed in the quiet dining room. "No, Mom. I am not funding a real estate flip with a man I met 3 months ago." Vincent's fake smile faltered, his eyes hardening. Margaret gasped, pressing a hand to her chest in a theatrical display of offense. Thomas, how can you be so disrespectful to Vincent? He is trying to build a legacy for our family. Margaret's voice shrilled, the charm evaporating in an instant. My answer is no, I repeated, keeping my voice low and steady. Let's just enjoy dinner. We aren't talking about money tonight. The atmosphere turned instantly frigid. Vincent pushed his plate away, suddenly claiming he had a headache. Fiona looked down at her lap, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to take a side. Margaret sat in stony silence for 10 minutes before abruptly pushing her chair back. I need to use the restroom, she announced coldly, marching out of the dining room and heading up the stairs. I sighed, rubbing my temples. I'm sorry, Fiona. I just can't do it anymore. She burns through cash like oxygen. I know, Tommy, Fiona whispered, but you know how she gets. She's been obsessing over this Florida thing for weeks. Vincent promised her a mansion on the beach. We sat in awkward silence for what felt like an eternity. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Is Mom okay? Fiona asked, glancing toward the hallway. She's been up there a while. Probably just cooling off, I said, or snooping through my medicine cabinet to see what brand of toothpaste I buy so she can criticize it. I didn't hear a thing. My house is solidly built, the walls thick with insulation. I didn't hear the creak of my office door. I didn't hear the heavy oak floorboard being lifted. I certainly didn't hear the smooth, mechanical spin of a combination dial. 20 minutes later, Margaret finally descended the stairs. Her demeanor had entirely changed. The stony fury was gone, replaced by a radiant, almost euphoric glow. Her cheeks were flushed, and she was practically humming under her breath. Well, she said, clapping her hands together. Vincent, darling, I think we should get going. We have an early morning tomorrow. Meetings, you know. Vincent stood up, looking momentarily confused by her sudden shift in mood, but he recovered quickly. Right, yes. Thank you for the meal, Thomas. Fiona stood up as well, grabbing her coat. I'll walk out with you guys. Thanks for dinner, Tommy. I walked them to the front door, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. The disaster had been averted, or so I thought. Margaret hugged me tightly at the door, kissing my cheek. I noticed a faint trace of dust on the sleeve of her expensive silk blouse. I love you, Tommy, she whispered in my ear. You've always been such a good provider. I locked the door behind them, exhaling a long, exhausted breath. The house was finally quiet. I started clearing the plates, the remnants of a fractured family dinner. I had just finished loading the dishwasher when I remembered the envelope in my jacket pocket. I had collected a final $2,000 cash payment from a private contracting job that afternoon. I needed to put it away before I forgot. I dried my hands on a towel and headed upstairs to my office. My home office was my sanctuary. It smelled of worn leather, old paper, and cedar. I walked behind my heavy mahogany desk, pushing the leather executive chair out of the way. I crouched down on the hardwood floor, my fingers finding the edge of the large Persian rug. I flipped the corner back, exposing the polished oak planks. There was a specific knot in the wood that served as a release catch. I pressed it, and a 2-foot section of the floorboard popped up seamlessly. I lifted it away, revealing the dark gray, heavy steel face of the Holland floor safe. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the thick envelope of cash, and set it on the floor beside me. I knelt down, my knee popping slightly, and grabbed the cold steel dial, 42 to the right, 17 to the left, 38 to the right. I knew the combination by heart. I hadn't changed it in 3 years. As I spun the dial, I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. The mechanical clicks were as crisp and reassuring as ever. I hit the final number, grasped the heavy chrome handle, and turned it. The heavy locking bolts retracted with a satisfying, deep clank. I pulled the heavy circular door upward on its hinge. I reached my hand in, expecting to feel the familiar texture of canvas money bags and the hard, velvet-lined box of my grandfather's coins. My hand touched the cold, bare steel at the bottom. I froze. My brain simply refused to process the sensory input. It was like looking at a math equation that defied logic. I blinked hard, leaning forward to cast my shadow out of the way so the overhead light could penetrate the deep steel cylinder. It was empty. Completely, utterly empty. No canvas bags. No stacks of hundreds wrapped in rubber bands. No velvet box of Krugerrands. Even my passport, which I kept tucked in the corner, was gone. A sound escaped my throat, a low, animalistic gasp of pure shock. The air in the room suddenly felt entirely too thin. My heart slammed against my ribs with the force of a sledgehammer, sending a wave of dizzying adrenaline straight to my brain. The edges of my vision blurred, darkening into a tunnel. $85,000. My mind raced through 1,000 impossible scenarios. Had I moved it? No, of course not. Had the house been robbed? But the front door was locked, there was no sign of forced entry, and the safe hadn't been drilled or torched. Someone had opened it with the combination. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I fell backward onto the rug, my hands gripping my hair, trying to anchor myself to reality. The floor under me felt like it was tilting. Then, I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak of a floorboard from the hallway. I snapped my head up. The door to my office was wide open. Standing in the doorway, bathed in the dim light of the hall, was Margaret. She hadn't left. She had sent Fiona and Vincent out to the car, pretending she forgot her purse or her scarf, and she had stayed behind. She was leaning casually against the doorframe, holding a fresh glass of my expensive Cabernet, looking down at me with an expression that froze the blood in my veins. It wasn't a look of guilt. It wasn't panic. It was a chilling, triumphant, patronizing smile. "Don't look so pale, Tommy," she said, taking a slow sip of her wine. Her voice was steady, devoid of any maternal warmth. It was the voice of a predator who had just swallowed the canary. I couldn't speak. My vocal cords were paralyzed. I just pointed a trembling finger at the gaping black hole in the floor. "Where is it?" I finally managed to croak, my voice cracking under the immense weight of the betrayal. "Where is it, Mom?" She let out a soft, dismissive sigh, stepping into the room. She looked around my beautiful office, running her hand along the edge of my mahogany desk. "You know, you really have done well for yourself, Thomas. A bit selfish, keeping all this hoarded away while your own mother struggles to find her footing, but impressive, nonetheless." I scrambled to my feet, my fists clenched so hard my fingernails bit into my palms. "I asked you a question. What did you do?" She turned to face me, the smile never leaving her lips. "I took what was rightfully mine. Consider it an early inheritance, or better yet, consider it back pay. Do you have any idea how much it cost to raise you and Fiona? The sacrifices I made? The years of my youth I threw away? You stole from me," I breathed, the reality finally shattering the shock, replacing it with a white-hot, blinding rage. "You cleaned out my life savings. How? How did you even know the combination?" She chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Oh, Tommy, you always were so predictable. You used the same numbers for everything. Your old high school locker, the pin to your first debit card. It only took me 3 tries when I came over to water the plants while you were in Chicago last month. I've just been waiting for the right moment. And today, when you so rudely humiliated Vincent and me at dinner, I realized the moment was now." "That was $85,000. I yelled, stepping toward her. "And Grandpa's coins. That is a felony, Margaret. I will call the police right now." She didn't flinch. In fact, her smile widened, revealing her teeth. "Go ahead," she challenged, taking another sip of wine. "Call them. What are you going to tell them? That you had nearly 100 grand in undocumented, untaxed cash hidden in a hole in the floor? Where are the bank withdrawal slips, Thomas? Where is the proof it ever existed?" She had me, and she knew it. The cash was off the books. The coins had been handed down privately before my grandfather died to avoid estate taxes. There was no paper trail. To the authorities, it would look like an angry son making up a wild story about a mother he had a grudge against. "Vincent is outside right now, transferring the bags to the trunk of his car," she continued smoothly. "We're going to Florida tonight. We have a real estate deal to close. Thanks to your generous investment. We're finally going to be rich, Tommy. And when we make our millions, maybe I'll pay you back. With interest. She set her wine glass down on my desk, her eyes locking onto mine with a cold, sociopathic detachment. You're a monster, I whispered, tears of absolute fury and betrayal stinging my eyes. You aren't my mother, you're just a parasite. Margaret's smile vanished, her face hardening into a vicious mask. I brought you into this world, Thomas. I fed you. I clothed you. Everything you are is because of me. You owed me this. Don't ever contact me again. She turned on her heel and walked out of the office. I stood there, paralyzed, listening to her footsteps descend the stairs. I heard the front door open, and then click shut. I heard the faint roar of Vincent's BMW starting in the driveway, the tires crunching against the gravel as they sped away into the night. I looked down at the empty steel belly of the safe. My life savings, the physical manifestation of 10 years of blood, sweat, and sacrifice, vanished in 20 minutes. My own mother had looked me in the eye and gutted me without a second thought. I slowly knelt back down. My hands stopped shaking. The overwhelming panic that had gripped my chest evaporated, replaced by a terrifying, absolute stillness. She thought she had won. She thought because there was no paper trail, I was powerless. She thought she was escaping to a sunny beach in Florida with her con artist boyfriend on my dime. But Margaret made one fatal miscalculation. She underestimated just how much of her ruthlessness she had passed down to her son. I reached into the empty safe and ran my hand along the bottom plate. I pressed my thumb against a hidden magnetic latch in the back corner. With a soft click, a false bottom popped up. She had found the main compartment, but she didn't know about the secondary, subfloor compartment. I pulled the false bottom away. Inside sat a secure, encrypted USB drive and a thick, sealed manila envelope containing documents that Vincent and my mother would literally kill to keep buried. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a number I hadn't called in 3 years. My best friend, Brian, who also happened to be a highly aggressive private investigator with a very specific set of skills. He answered on the second ring. Tommy? It's late, man. What's going on? Brian, I said, my voice eerily calm. I need you to run a trace on a license plate, and then I need you to help me destroy 2 people's lives. Brian Gallagher arrived at my house 20 minutes after I called him, the tires of his unmarked Ford Explorer tearing up the wet asphalt of my driveway. Brian and I went way back. We played varsity football together, but while I went into the HVAC trade, Brian did 2 tours in Afghanistan before opening a boutique private investigations firm downtown. He was a broad-shouldered, fiercely loyal guy who operated strictly in the gray areas of the law. He walked into my office, took one look at the open, empty safe, and then looked at my face. He didn't ask stupid questions. He just pulled out a notepad and a burner phone. Who? Brian asked, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. Margaret, I replied, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. And the new boyfriend, Vincent. Brian let out a slow, heavy breath, dragging a hand over his close-cropped hair. I told you, Tommy. I told you 3 months ago when you asked me to run that preliminary background check on him. The guy was a walking red flag. I just didn't think your own mother would cross this line. Neither did I said quietly. I reached down and picked up the sealed manila envelope and the encrypted USB drive from the hidden subcompartment of the safe. I tossed them onto my mahogany desk, but you were right, and I'm done protecting her. Open it. Brian tore the seal off the envelope and spread the documents across the desk. This was my insurance policy. When Margaret first brought Vincent around, boasting about his venture capitalist millions, my gut had twisted into knots. I had secretly paid Brian $5,000 to dig into the man's past. What Brian found was so devastating, so legally radioactive, that I had locked it away, paralyzed by the guilt of what it would do to my family if I exposed it. I had been foolishly waiting for Margaret to wake up and leave him on her own. Let's review the tape, Brian said, tapping a glossy mugshot pinned to a rap sheet. Vincent's real name is Victor Kincaid. He's a career grifter. He doesn't flip commercial real estate. He flips lonely, desperate women. He has active, unserved felony warrants in Nevada for wire fraud and another in Arizona for grand larceny. He skipped bail 2 years ago. And the car? I asked, my voice turning to ice. A 2023 BMW 7 Series, leased under a Shell LLC that's currently 60 days delinquent on payments, Brian said, pulling out his laptop and plugging in the USB drive. Which is beautiful for us, because subprime auto lenders are paranoid. That car is equipped with a hardwired, unjammable GPS telematics module. I scraped the tracking codes last month just in case. As Brian's fingers flew across his keyboard, pulling up a satellite mapping program, I turned my attention to the other stack of papers on the desk. This was the part that hurt the most. It wasn't just about Victor Kincaid. It was about Margaret. A year ago, Fiona had been rejected for a tiny, low-limit auto loan. It made no sense. Fiona paid her bills. When I helped her pull her credit report, we found a disaster. Someone had opened 6 different credit cards in Fiona's name, maxed them out, and let them default to collections. The mailing address for the cards was a P.O. box in the next town over. Brian had tracked the P.O. box back to our mother. Margaret had stolen her own daughter's social security number to fund her shopping addictions, effectively destroying Fiona's financial future. I had confronted Margaret privately. She wept, she begged, she threatened to take her own life. She manipulated me perfectly. I paid off the balances to keep Fiona from finding out and pressing charges, but I kept the evidence. I kept the forged signature documents, the bank statements, the IP logs. Got them, Brian announced, snapping me out of my dark reverie. He spun the laptop around. A blinking red dot was stationary on the map, hundreds of miles south of us. They didn't go straight to Florida. They stopped to celebrate. The tracker shows the BMW is parked in the VIP garage of the Ocean Vista Resort and Casino in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. They pulled in about 10 minutes ago. I looked at the clock. It was pushing midnight. They had driven straight down the coast, eager to put distance between us, their pockets bulging with my life savings. They're settling in for the night, Brian said, closing the laptop with a sharp snap. Probably popping champagne in a top-floor suite right now, thinking they pulled off the heist of the century. So, what's the play, Tommy? We call the local PD, fax over the warrants, and let the state troopers kick their door in? No, I said, grabbing my keys off the desk. If the police raid that room right now, my cash goes straight into a civil asset forfeiture locker as evidence in Victor's fraud case. I'll be fighting the federal government for 10 years to get my money back. And I have no proof it's mine. We need to get the cash and the coins first. Then, we feed them to the wolves. Brian grinned, a predatory flash of teeth in the dim light of the office. I was hoping you'd say that. Grab a jacket, Tommy. We've got a long drive ahead of us. The drive to Myrtle Beach took 6 agonizing hours. I stared out the passenger window into the pitch-black night, fueled by a dangerous cocktail of black coffee, adrenaline, and cold, crystalline rage. Every mile we chewed up was a mile further away from the son Margaret thought she knew. She expected me to weep, to panic, to accept my role as the eternal victim of her chaotic life. She had no idea the monster she had just awakened. We pulled into the sprawling, palm tree-lined driveway of the Ocean Vista Resort, just as the sun was beginning to peek over the Atlantic Ocean, casting a bruised purple light over the massive hotel. Brian parked the Explorer down the street. He reached into his tactical bag and pulled out a cloned master RFID keycard, a perk of having friends in the hospitality security industry. According to the front desk logs I just breached, Victor Kincaid, alias Vincent, booked the penthouse suite using a prepaid debit card, Brian muttered, checking his phone. Room 1402. Knowing grifters, they won't be awake before noon, but we can't risk a confrontation in the room. If he pulls a weapon, this turns into a homicide investigation. We wait until they leave the room, I said firmly. They didn't drive all the way to a casino resort just to sleep. They're going to want to spend my money. We spent the next 4 hours sitting in the lobby cafe, obscured by fake ficus trees and newspapers. At exactly 10:45 a.m., the elevator doors chimed. And there they were. Margaret and Victor strolled out, looking like caricatures of newly minted wealth. Victor was wearing a garish, silk-patterned shirt and expensive new sunglasses. Margaret was draped in a fresh linen resort dress, carrying a designer boutique shopping bag, a smug, relaxed smile plastered across her face. They walked arm in arm toward the casino floor, heading straight for the high roller tables. They were completely oblivious to the fact that I was sitting less than 50 feet away, watching them burn through the money I had bled for. "Showtime," Brian whispered. We moved quickly to the elevators, riding up to the 14th floor in absolute silence. The hallway was deeply carpeted and smelled of expensive vanilla diffusers. Brian slid the cloned RFID card into the lock of room 1402. The light blinked green, and the heavy door clicked open. We slipped inside and locked the deadbolt behind us. The suite was a mess of room service trays, empty champagne bottles, and hastily discarded clothes. "Find the safe," Brian commanded, sweeping the living area. "He didn't use the room safe," I said, pointing toward the unmade king-sized bed. There, sitting carelessly on the mattress, were my two heavy olive-drab canvas bags. Victor was too arrogant, too drunk on his own success, to even bother hiding them. He probably assumed nobody would dare enter the penthouse. I rushed over and unzipped the first bag. The crisp stacks of $100 bills were still there, bound in my familiar rubber bands. I checked the second bag. The velvet box holding my grandfather's Krugerrands was untouched. I did a rapid estimation. They had skimmed maybe $5,000 or $6,000 off the top for their shopping spree and the hotel room, but the vast majority of my $85,000 was still here. "Bag it up," Brian said, keeping a watch by the peephole. I transferred the cash and the coins into my own duffel bag. Then, I turned to the canvas bags they had left behind. I wasn't just going to leave them empty. I wanted Margaret to understand exactly who had ended her fantasy. From my jacket, I pulled out the thick stack of papers. I placed Victor Kincaid's multi-state felony arrest warrants right on top. Beneath that, I placed the meticulously documented evidence of Margaret's credit card fraud, complete with the IP addresses tracing the crimes directly to her laptop. Finally, I took out a hotel pen and wrote a single sentence on the back of Victor's mugshot. "Consider it back pay." I zipped the canvas bags back up, leaving them in the exact position we found them. "We're clear," Brian said. We slipped out of the room, leaving no trace we had ever been there, except for the ticking time bomb resting on their bed. Once we were safely back in the Explorer, parked across the street from the resort's main entrance, Brian pulled out his burner phone. He dialed the non-emergency line for the local Myrtle Beach Police Department. "Yes, dispatch," Brian said, dropping his voice into a professional, authoritative cadence. "I am a licensed private investigator calling to report the exact location of a wanted federal fugitive. His name is Victor Kincaid. He has active felony warrants out of Nevada and Arizona for wire fraud. He is currently on the casino floor of the Ocean Vista Resort, wearing a loud silk shirt. He is accompanied by a female accomplice. I suggest you send multiple units. He has a history of running." Brian hung up, cracked his window, and lit an American Spirit cigarette. "Now, we wait for the fireworks." It didn't take long. Less than 10 minutes later, 3 black and white police cruisers silently rolled up to the front of the hotel, lights flashing but sirens off so as not to spook the target. 5 heavily armed officers rushed through the revolving glass doors. We had a perfect view of the resort's massive glass front lobby. 5 minutes later, the scene unfolded like a beautifully directed movie. Victor and Margaret emerged from the casino concourse, heading back toward the elevators. Margaret was laughing, clutching Victor's arm. Suddenly, the police officers intercepted them. I watched Victor's smug, tanned face drain of all color. He immediately threw his hands up, backing away, but 2 officers grabbed him, slamming him hard against the marble wall of the lobby. The handcuffs came out, glinting under the chandelier lights. Margaret shrieked. Even through the thick glass of our car, I could almost hear the shrill, frantic pitch of her voice. She began yelling at the officers, swatting at them with her expensive purse, playing the role of the outraged, wealthy socialite. An officer grabbed her wrists, spun her around, and cuffed her too. Victor was screaming at her, his charming facade completely shattered. He was likely blaming her, thinking she had set him up. Margaret looked utterly bewildered, crying hysterically as they were frog-marched out of the hotel lobby and shoved into the back of separate squad cars. They hadn't even made it back to the room. They hadn't seen the empty canvas bags yet. They didn't know that Victor was going to federal prison for years, and that Margaret was about to face a mountain of identity theft charges that would ensure she never held a credit card or a lease in her own name again. I sat back against the leather seat of the Explorer, feeling the heavy duffel bag of cash resting against my boots. My heart rate finally began to slow. The paralyzing shock of the night before had been completely burned away, replaced by a cold, hollow sense of closure. "You good, Tommy?" Brian asked quietly, putting the truck into gear. I looked at the squad cars pulling away, their sirens finally wailing as they disappeared down the coastal highway, taking my mother out of my life forever. "Yeah," I said, my voice steady. "Let's go home." The ride back to my house was silent, save for the hum of the tires against the interstate and the rhythmic drumming of rain against the windshield. When we finally pulled into my driveway, I didn't bother putting the canvas bags back under the floorboards. I was done living like a paranoid ghost in my own home. First thing the next morning, I drove straight to First National Trust and opened a maximum security safety deposit box. The cash and the Krugerrands were finally locked behind 10 inches of reinforced steel and armed guards. 3 days later, the dust settled, and the absolute destruction of Margaret's life became public record. I received a phone call from a detective, James Russo, a hardened investigator with the Myrtle Beach Police Department. He wanted to ask me a few questions about my mother's arrest. I played the part of the shocked, heartbroken son perfectly. I told him my mother had run off with a man we barely knew and that we were worried sick. Russo then explained the severity of the situation. The feds had swooped in and taken federal custody of Victor Kincaid. The man was staring down a 20-year sentence in a maximum security penitentiary for his multi-state wire fraud operations. But Margaret's situation was arguably just as bleak. The local assistant district attorney, a pit bull of a prosecutor named Mitchell Klein, had taken one look at the thick dossier of credit card fraud we left on the bed and immediately filed 6 counts of felony identity theft. Because she was caught actively fleeing the state with a wanted federal fugitive, the judge denied her bail entirely, labeling her an extreme flight risk. Then came the phone call. It was a Tuesday evening, exactly 1 week after that disastrous family dinner. My cell phone buzzed with an incoming call from an out-of-state correctional facility. I accepted the charges, leaning back in my heavy leather office chair, staring at the exact spot on the rug where my safe was hidden. "Tommy?" Margaret's voice was a cracked, raspy whisper. All the arrogant, patronizing bravado from the night she robbed me was completely gone. She sounded small, terrified, and utterly broken. "Tommy, oh thank God, you have to get me out of here. It's awful. They treat me like an absolute animal." "Hello, Margaret," I said, my voice deadpan. "Tommy, listen to me," she sobbed frantically, her breathing shallow and panicked. "Victor set me up. That bastard put stolen files in our hotel room. The police are trying to say I stole Fiona's identity. It's a setup. You have to hire me a lawyer. Call your friend Brian, mortgage your house if you have to. I need a good defense attorney. I need $50,000 for a retainer right now." I let her cry for a solid 10 seconds, just listening to the desperate, hyperventilating panic echoing over the crackling prison line. "I would love to help you out, Mom," I said smoothly, keeping my tone impossibly polite. "But honestly, I just don't have the cash. All my savings mysteriously vanished a week ago." There was a dead, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. I could practically hear the gears violently grinding in her head, the sudden, horrific realization dawning on her as the pieces finally snapped together. "You," she breathed, her voice trembling so hard it sounded like static. "That was, to you?" "Consider it back pay," I whispered, echoing the exact words she had thrown in my face. "For Fiona, and for me. Don't ever call this number again." I hung up the phone and permanently blocked the facility's prefix. It was the last time I ever spoke to my mother. The hardest part of the entire ordeal was telling Fiona. I sat my little sister down in my living room and laid out everything: the theft of my life savings, Victor's real criminal identity, and most painfully, the undeniable, documented proof that Margaret had deliberately destroyed her credit score. Fiona wept for hours. But when the tears finally stopped, a new, resilient light appeared in her eyes. The heavy chains of guilt and familial obligation that tied her to our toxic mother were finally severed. We hired a specialized financial attorney, David Rosen, to help Fiona navigate the complex identity theft claims. Armed with the police reports from South Carolina and Margaret's pending criminal trial, the creditors eventually wiped the fraudulent charges from Fiona's record completely. Her credit score rebounded rapidly, and 6 months later, I co-signed on a beautiful, modern townhome for her. Karma is a ruthless, uncompromising debt collector, and Margaret's bill had finally come due. She was convicted on 4 counts of felony fraud. Because of her lack of a prior violent criminal record, she avoided a multi-decade sentence, but the judge still handed down 4 solid years in a state correctional facility, followed by 5 years of heavily monitored probation and mandatory financial restitution. She lost her leased apartment. Her designer clothes were seized and sold off at police auction, and her reputation was permanently reduced to ash. As for me, I stopped hoarding cash under the floorboards like a frightened child preparing for winter. I met with a legitimate wealth management firm, properly invested my capital, and expanded my commercial HVAC business into 2 neighboring counties. My house is peaceful now. When I sit in my mahogany office, the air doesn't feel heavy with the anxiety of an impending financial disaster. I am no longer the terrified little boy waiting for his mother to ruin his life. I am the man who built an impenetrable fortress, and when the wolf finally managed to get inside, I didn't just fight back, I locked the door and burned the wolf alive. If this story of ultimate betrayal and hard-hitting karma sent chills down your spine, do me a huge favor. Smash that like button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder to protect their peace, and hit subscribe for more unbelievable, true-life drama. Drop a comment below. Would you have done the exact same thing to your own mother? Let me know, and I'll see you next time.